Hello, my name is Krzysztof Zieliński, and today I have a great pleasure and honor to conduct a very special interview on behalf of Mały, Leksykon, Wielkich, Zespołów, as today I will be talking to Clive Nolan, the renowned composer, progressive rock legend, known from his works in inter alia Arena, Pendragon, Strangers on a Train, and Shadowland. And last but not least, the writer and creator of She, Alchemy, and King's Ransom musicals. Clive, thank you very much for the opportunity and willingness to discuss the latest epic musical of yours, The Mortal Light.
Oh, pleasure. Actually, it's taken such a long time to come out that it seems a bit unreal to be actually doing interviews about it because, yeah, it's been, I mean, this whole thing was written in 2020. So it has taken ages. But anyway, there we go.
And before we dive into the album itself, I would like to first ask you about the relation to the world of musicals and what your relation to the world of musicals is. And where did your passion for writing musicals actually come from? Do you fancy this particular form of musical expression, and why do you fancy it?
Well, I think as a child, when I used to listen to, my parents had what they call a radiogram. So it was kind of a record player with speakers, and it was all done like in walnut. It was a beautiful piece of furniture. And at a very young age, I worked at, I learned how to put the record on, put the needle on and listen. And the albums that they happened to have, a lot of them were musicals. There was a lot of classical music there, and musicals was the other thing they had. And because of the way my dad worked in the music industry himself, he'd ended up with a lot of musicals albums, which were in plain covers. So I didn't have the information that would have explained exactly what was going on in the musical. So I had things like South Pacific, My Fair Lady, Sound of Music, whatever. And there was very little information, so I was kind of making up the stories to go with the music I was listening to. But I was fascinated by that. I mean, the beauty of, well, in fact, opera, musicals, all that stuff is it's dance, it's singing, it's color, it's costume, it's scenery. It could be set in any period of time, and to me that's the sort of stuff I really like. So it was an inevitability that somewhere down the line of what I do, I would end up, I think, writing something of this nature. And when the opportunity arose, thanks to Metal Mind in Poland, actually, I guess I had enough credibility to make it possible. Then I wrote She, and we've sort of continued down that route since then.
And speaking of writing the musical, I would like to ask you a question regarding the album and the process of writing it, because I would like to know more about the story behind the creation of The Mortal Light. When did the spark that inspired you to write the third part of Samuel King's adventure actually happen? And is it also true that you wrote the story in less than 2 days?
Well, I mean, the whole thing about The Mortal Light, King's Ransom and Alchemy, it all began, I can't remember now, probably about 12 years ago, I'm guessing, roughly, when I had the idea for a kind of universe, for want of a, that's what Marvel calls their superheroes, isn't it? But it's that sort of universe where there were these characters and within a certain kind of historic period. So I kind of knew what I wanted. I wanted it to be Victorian, but I wanted it to be slightly fantastical. So I wanted this steampunk element to it. So it had a sort of fantasy potential. I wanted certain key characters. I wanted a character like Professor King, who was very much a kind of strange combination of Doctor Who and Professor Challenger and Indiana Jones, that sort of thing. And the other characters similarly, there had to be the right kind of baddie. So when I first created Alchemy as an idea, it was almost like a sort of scenario rather than a story. But that scenario stretches out to King's Ransom and to Mortal Light. So the spark for Mortal Light was 12 years ago. But the actual storyline, once I'd finished King's Ransom and that album came out, and we actually worked on some stage productions of it, I started thinking about the story for the next one. And initially it took me ages, not 2 days. It took me, months on and off of piecing together. I had this sort of vague idea, if you like, a beginning, a middle and an end, but somehow kind of making it all work. And eventually I had a story which was too complicated in truth. And in fact, the director of Alchemy, the movie that's being made at the moment, sort of, he said, he kind of liked the idea, but it seemed to be quite complicated. And in the end, I did what's always hard to do for a composer or a writer or a creator of anything artistic. I pretty much threw it in the bin. That was the tough decision. That was about a year after I'd begun this whole process, and I just thought, no, this isn't working. I threw it in the bin. And by that I mean I just started again. There were key elements that I knew would stay in there, but a lot of it were just going to have to go. Once I'd cleared my head, once I'd made that decision, suddenly the story crystallized in my head. And then, yes, within 2 days, I had it done, and it made sense, and it hung together, and that was fine. And of course, you can't, well, in my mind anyway, I can't write a musical. I can't write the music till I know what the story is. So once I had the story, I split it into episodes. This happens, that happens, that happens. And it splits into little episodes. And then you can start to see how a song might work with a particular part of that flow. At which point then I'm ready to start writing the music. So yeah, it's a spark, definitely, but a very long spark.
And since we are already talking about the narrative aspect of the Mortal Light and its setting, because as you said, it's set in a gothic steampunk setting of Victorian England, where this mysticism and mystery and intrigue intertwine with theatricality, humor, and constant excitement of the unfolding expedition. And I would like to ask you why you chose that particular setting and what inspired you to set the action of the musical in this universe.
Well, I've always been fascinated by the Victorian era. I think that the Victorian era was that wonderful combination of discovery, understanding, and ignorance. And so in the Victorian era, there was still plenty of room for the magical things to happen. But you could still kind of, but they were discovering things. Science was developing at a fast rate. Technology really was developing at a fast rate. I think that I've always found that period to be a particularly interesting one. I love the Dickens, obviously, and a lot of the sort of stories that emerged out of that. She, of course, was written in the Victorian era as well. And it's the way that the Victorians saw their future in their own, which is really where steampunk comes from. It's that idea of something futuristic, but through the eyes of a Victorian, when they wouldn't have discovered certain things. So in their heads, it was all about steam that would provide the power. And then, you'd have this wonderful, like the time machine is a classic example. You have the wonderful idea that this machine can take you throughout time, but you're still going to sit in a really nice quality leather chair to do it. It's kind of got that sort of element to it. Luxury, a combination of luxury. So I've always found that period, the Victorian era and of course the Viking era are the two places in history which fascinate me the most.
And have any particular steampunk, gothic, or Victorian works inspired you? For example, from literature, music, or musical pieces? If so, could you share which ones?
as far as steampunk, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think the Time Machine is probably one of the first and very sort of definitive piece of steampunk, whether it's the book, the films. I love the films as well, and the films themselves, there are two that I consider were made, one in the sort of early 60s, one was made much more recently, I think the 90s, maybe the 2000s, and the way that they've treated the original story is really interesting, and I think actually adds something to the kind of whole idea. So I think it's a fascinating book in itself. But obviously a lot of the great composers of the time and the music of the time, and I mean, I don't know who you want to pick on really, but sort of Elgar would have emerged out of the Victorian era. There was something very Victorian about some of the music he wrote. In general, it's just a fascinating period of time, a lot of history, a lot of things that were done in that time, the reign of Queen Victoria, of course. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot there.
And while listening to the music itself struck me as also baroque in its momentum, yet with a rock flavor, especially in tracks like Cavalry or Guardians. And how do you navigate the border between a more classic theatrical orchestration, the cinematic approach, and the mad energy of progressive rock? Do you approach composing a more rock track differently than a musical track, or is it for you the same storytelling language?
No, well, I've always said when I'm writing albums or writing music, I have to be wearing the right metaphorical hat. So if I was writing for Arena, there's kind of one hat. If I'm writing for, I don't know, Shadowland or something, it will be something else. And the musicals, something else again. The musicals in many ways are the kind of most sort of me on some levels, because first of all, I'm not co-writing, I'm writing on my own. And secondly, it's a kind of to me, it's a kind of a comfortable environment, because I think when you're writing a musical, you can kind of utilize anything. When I write for Arena, or we put an Arena album together, it's got to sound a particular way. It's got to sound like Arena, and it's got to, you've got to have your guitar leads and your keyboard leads and the structures and the progressive rock and blah, blah, blah. With a musical, 1 minute you could be in China, 1 minute you can be in Victorian times or Viking times or futuristic or whatever. There's no boundaries. To me, it always I do it. It starts with a kind of orchestral attitude, because that's how I visualize it, but that's just my choice. The rock elements, in my mind, are part of that orchestra. I'm not writing for orchestra and rock band. I mean, electric guitar, drums, bass, what have you, were now integrated into my musicals orchestra, as far as I'm concerned. So I'm not bringing together different things. It is one thing in its own right, which is why you're going to get something like Wings in The Mortal Light, one of the songs, which sounds like it's just stumbled its way out of My Fair Lady, with a kind of very orchestral, very lightweight sort of orchestral approach. And then you're going to get sort of almost comedic elements, like in Crime, with the way that the strings and stuff are used. And then on the other hand, you go across to Cavalry, and it's quite rocky, and you've got a much more sort of obvious presence of electric guitar, drums, etc. It's where the mood takes you within the context of the musical. I like to think it's consistent within the musical and the storytelling.
Thank you. And I would also like to ask you about the immersion and the sound design of the album, because without a doubt, the album has an audio movie quality because of the sound effects included in the album, such as the crowd talking, the pyrotechnics dropping, and the spatial mixing. And how vital is it in musical that the non-musical level takes place, and how much of a help is it for the listener to visualize the scenes without a stage?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, certainly when I've listened to, as a child, when I listened to those soundtrack recordings, there probably wasn't a lot of incidental sound effects, unless it was really important. You know, I mean, watch out, everybody! It's going to explode. You're going to have an explosion. But I like to do it because, to me, it helps to kind of paint the full picture. It's almost like that element of a radio play or something. You kind of I like having those elements. To me, they're part of the music. You know, to have the crowd grumbling and reacting and shouting or whatever it is, if they're relevant to the scene, is part of what the chorus would be doing on stage, or in a film or what have you. So to me, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I'm only painting. It's a little bit like the what's his name, Sergio Leone, wasn't it? Who did the spaghetti westerns? He made a lot of use of sound effects, but he would always he'd choose the ones he wanted people to hear. Those would be the things that were really front of the kind of audio thing, and a lot of other things that you probably don't even think about were barely audible. So it's, you know, I'm only painting the things that are important. You're not hearing people's footsteps when they're walking around or anything like that. What you're hearing are the things that help to really color a particular moment in a scene.
And before I ask you more specific questions about the storytelling elements in the album, I would like to ask you, how would you describe the story in the album in a few short sentences? Could you tell me more about the story in the album?
I think that Professor King and his team, you know, the essence of any one of these musicals is for him and his team to kind of face some kind of danger which represents a larger danger to perhaps the country or other people or the world, whatever. So the same idea is there in this particular one. It's a bit of, you know, sort of Victorian style nonsense, really, but that's the fun of it. And in this particular case, Professor King has been made aware that there is a super baddie out there called Macaria, out in the northern wastes of Norway, and really, it's going to come down to him trying to stop her from, you know, destroying the world, as it were. So that's your central theme. And then you basically you follow a journey. You say Professor King and his team follow the journey through till they finally face off against Macaria. And during that journey, we learn a little more about the relationship between different characters. There's a love story involved. There are moments of peril, and there are moments of comedy along the way. It's no more complicated than that.
And since you've already mentioned the elements of comedy, I have noticed that you balance sacrum with profanum and horror with humor. We have a dark goddess threatening the world on one hand, and the clumsy yet very charming Alice Hyde on the other. And how important is it to do so in musicals? And how difficult is it to maintain that balance so the humor doesn't undermine the gravity of the threat presented in the story?
I had a meeting with a lady who was involved. Well, involved. She was very involved in the West End as a choreographer, as a producer. This was quite a few years. It was after I'd written She, but around the time I was writing Alchemy, and she said that there's a lot of different things she told me, but the main thing I took away from that, she said, when you write a musical nowadays, particularly, you have to include everything. You've got to have the tragedy, you've got to have the comedy, you've got to have the adventure, you've got to have those introspective moments, you've got to have the love, you've got to have the hate, you've got to put it all in there somehow. And I thought that was pretty good advice, because when I wrote She, initially I I actually removed all the humor. It was kind of quite a serious piece. I've since added material and rejigged it and such for the stage, and brought the humor back into it. With Alchemy, I made a point of bringing it in a little bit. I was almost a bit tentative about that side of it, because you don't know how people are going to react, but I did. And then gradually I've become more comfortable with that balance in King's Ransom and Immortal Light, because there is, in life, there is always that mixture of things, and it's true that you get all of it, and humor is part of it, and humor doesn't undermine the main story, because it's how people react. It is a natural way for people to react in certain situations, and I think it also helps to keep the audience comfortable along the way a little bit. You don't necessarily want them to feel threatened all the way through a story, so you have to kind of make it kind of rise and fall along the way. So to me, I think it's a very good way of keeping the story moving forward, keeping it positive, as well as it's almost like having a sorbet between different parts of a meal, courses of a meal. It cleans the palate ready for the next moment. So in this particular comedy, just kind of brings you back down, and then you can have something which will be more dramatic. It will seem more dramatic as well because of what you've just preceded. So it's a useful part of the whole.
In that case, would you say that musicals reflect life on a much fuller, more full scale than, for example, a concept album of a progressive rock or something else?
I think it probably depends on the listener or the viewer. In my mind, I think perhaps it does. There's room to put perhaps more elements of life into a musical than there might be into a concept album. I think, yes, I would say so. In my opinion, I think it probably does reflect life better. But a musical in itself isn't unrealistic. There are people in Arena who would remind me that you don't walk down the street and suddenly break into song, at which point 20 other people jump out and suddenly know the dance moves. I mean, it's true. It's a fantasy journey in itself, but perhaps you can cover a little bit more emotional content within those storylines.
Thanks. And I would like to ask you about the psychology profiles of characters in your musical, because as well as musicals in general, actually, as a form of a theatrical expression in music, because characters in The Mortal Light are various, and while every character is very unique, I believe it is possible to assign them to some classic archetypes, such as the romantic lead, the villain, the comic relief, the anti-hero, or the mentor, or a parental figure. Therefore, my question is whether you could tell me more about the structure of designing characters in the musical.
I don't think I necessarily gave that much thought when I started this process. I just did what felt natural, but you're absolutely right. They are absolutely archetypal style of characters, and you kind of have to have them all in there in some form. And I think it was quite a natural process to kind of, as I was sort of thinking, okay, well, we need a leader, as you say, or a mentor, or we need a baddie. So I think, yes, they are. And I think there's a reason for that as well. I think they have to sort of fit into pigeonholes in a musical, because you've only got, say, 2 hours to kind of get everything done, like in a movie. You don't have a lot of time to especially when you've got an ensemble of characters. You don't have a lot of time to explore complex backstories and emotional depths and all the rest of it. You've got to kind of know who you're dealing with quite quickly, and then you as a listener or a watcher, you kind of can move on to see the big story. So I think that's why it makes sense. I mean, it would be different, I suppose, if it was a musical about one person. and the way that they explored and developed and this, that. You could go down that route and then you could be less archetypal, of course, but that's not what I was attempting to write. You know, mine is an adventure. It's not supposed to have ridiculous depths to it. It's supposed to be fun. That's all. So yes, the archetypal characters are definitely there, but that came very naturally. I didn't sit and think, right, we need to have a mentor, we need to have a father figure, got to have this, got to have that. It just came very naturally. I mean, I've written stories before I ever got to alchemy. It's a natural process for me, whether I write lyrics or stories or concepts or whatever. So I guess there's a sort of a language in there that is reasonably natural to me.
So they are a bit like smaller puzzle pieces that create a bigger picture of the whole musical.
I think so. I think they have to, you know, the kind of characters are, they have to be there. They are the important part of that picture, that, you know, as it fits together. Yeah.
And since we are talking about the characters of the musical, I would like to ask you about the antagonist of the album, so Macaria. And you chose Laura Piazzai for the role of her, and her rock voice adds a great layer of danger and depth to the character. Macaria, according to the musical, is Tovenar's twin sister. And what inspired you to create this twisted sibling dynamic and her as the core of the conflict?
Yeah, again, I mean, you know, when I originally did my sort of the first notes that I put together for the story, I had this idea that there was a kind of a yin and yang, good and bad, whatever, these two people, and it was a lot more complicated, and I had this whole history. God, I must have the notes somewhere. The whole history of where this mortal light amulet would have traveled from certain period of history where it was discovered, and it changed countries because a king gave it to the person that he was in love with, and it really, honestly, it's the stuff that you'd make a film in itself just about the amulet. But ultimately, and then I also have this, you know, my original idea was that Tovenar will be imprisoned, and in fact there was going to be this key, which was this black obsidian. In fact, the musical at one point was called the Obsidian Key. Not, it's a completely different. And the team were going to have to go and find that, and blah 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 blah. And it was all quite complicated. But throughout, as I gradually sort of threw all that away or cleared it out and simplified, it still came down to these two people. One good, one sort of evil. And of course, the focus point for that would be Macaria. So it was kind of a natural process again to get to that point. And by that stage, I was working with Laura with other stuff. And I just thought, well, that's the voice that will suit this part very. And it was the first song I wrote for The Mortal Light was the song Macaria. And I got Laura to sing it. And so that existed a long time, well, a year before I started writing the musical for real.
And how about the origin of the name of the character? Because I believe it refers to a minor Greek goddess of blessed death and daughter of Hades and Persephone. Did you also go deep down to this Greek mythology, or did the name come out naturally?
Actually, I didn't. You're telling me something I'm not that aware of. No, I just made the name up because it sounded good.
Oh,
yeah, I didn't research a name that would suit her character. I just had this sort of sound, and it eventually came out as Macaria. You can imagine Dickens sitting in his office trying to write the Christmas Carol, and he wants that character Ebenezer Scrooge, and he's trying to think of a name that somehow describes he was scheming, and eventually he came up with Scrooge. Well, you know, similarly I was thinking of a character that would suit that, and the name just came as with Tovenar. I didn't research that. It was always a bit risky with something like that because if I remember rightly, I came up with the name, and I probably did look it up online to make sure that you know, it wasn't sort of like the name of a famous serial killer or something. But I don't remember seeing anything particularly that put me off using the name. So yeah, but that was just creative.
I have a question about Samuel King himself, who is the hero of The Mortal Light and a charismatic and a brilliant strategist. And because you have embodied Samuel King since Alchemy, and I've noticed that you play him with masterful intuition, as if the hero is second nature to you. So my question is, what inspired you to create the character of Samuel King in the first place? And did you base him on some character from fiction, or perhaps Samuel King is your musical alter ego?
It was a bit of both, really. I mean, I needed to have somebody who would glue the stories together. So someone with whom you can travel through the story. So that was a starter. I was also very aware of you know, the practicality of finding singers and paying musicians and all the rest of it. I just figured, well, look, I'll do this myself, because I could be the most consistent element to this since I was writing it. And then it was really inspired by those kind of characters that have always sort of appealed to me. Like I say, Doctor Who, for example, Indiana Jones, Professor Challenger, who perhaps is less known by people, but and again, one of those kind of characters, someone who's curious, someone who's always planning ahead and trying to kind of work out how to kind of get where they're going. But very much like in the Indiana Jones films, particularly the original, the Lost, what was it? Yeah, Indiana Jones, the Lost. Basically, the character is actually has no real effect on things along the way. I mean, Indiana Jones doesn't have any effect on the plot. He is just, you know, moved along as if in rapids, you know, moved along by the plot, and reacts to things as he goes and does his best to kind of, but really he's just, you know, he's a victim of the plot, really. And the same thing applies to King. You know, he's sort of doing stuff and attempting to kind of make things happen, but the things happen despite his best efforts, in a way. And I quite like that. It's an interesting thing. And as I say, I mean, Professor King is the glue that holds the stories together and holds the team together and keeps the characters revolving around him. And even to the point where when I wrote Alchemy and King's Ransom, I was also very aware that because you have a lot of main songs for people, but there's a lot of other stuff, interactive line here and a line there, and a multi-voice piece with an extra. And so I would use King to fill in all the parts that I didn't want to hassle any of the other singers with. So basically, you know, I don't really want to have to make them sing this one, or that's going to cost me more money. Right, King, you do that. So there was an element of practicality to the writing and the structure of the story and the structure of the theatre piece and whatever that was involved with that as well. And also, yeah, there's a really good dose of me in there. Not the heroic part, probably, but there's certainly an element of me in the character, of course.
Thank you. And the vocal acting itself is also fantastic on the album. Even without any visual layer, every character retains a unique and distinct personality, as we have already established. For example, the listener can instantly hear Alice's charming clumsiness or Lord Jagma's cynical nature just through their intonation. And my question is, how do you work with your vocalists to achieve such a high level of voice acting? Do you give them strict directional instructions on how to emote? Or do you cast specific singers because, for instance, you know their natural personality already fits the character, for example?
Well, that again depends on the singer. Some of them, I know they'll go down a particular route. Sometimes I will kind of guide them a little bit. Other times it's all in the writing, you know, their choice of words, the choice of vocal lines, the atmosphere within which they're singing. will also guide how they come across. So it depends on the song and it depends on the singer. There's no one rule for that. But you know, for me, the trick is to find the right singer for the role. And then very often most of the work is, you know, they're going to do themselves. I already knew, for example, what Laura was capable of, so I knew it wouldn't take much to get her to be that character. I knew exactly what Andy Sears would be like because he'd already played Jagman. We'd already done that. So that was just an extension of the same thing. So it's, you know, it's kind of like, and Christine, who did Alice, has actually recorded all her stuff in Norway because she's Norwegian. But I just, with her, I sent, you know, there was a clear set of instructions. And the other thing that I think is important, I demo every single song. That's Alchemy, King's Ransom, The Mortal Light, actually she as well, but I demo every single song myself. So before, I mean, it sounds kind of funny sometimes when people listen to it, but before anybody gets anything, you know, like from the soprano to the bass, I do everything, every choir part, every single solo vocal. So there's already clues in there. So when I would have sent, for example, I would have sent Christine the Alice parts, I was performing them. By the time Christine got them, it may well have been some of them were performed by Gemma, because I just wanted to get a female voice rather than my sort of Monty Python sort of voice. So it may well have been that but by that stage we were already defining the nature of the character. So for Gemma, when she sang the demos, I might have said, right, I need, you know, think Mary Poppins, whatever. And so, you know, by the time Christine got the information she needed with the lyrics, the scenario, the storylines that she was involved in, the vocal lines, you know, there was enough information for her to just take it from there, really.
And I would like to ask you about the bonus content of the physical CD release of the album, because apart from Act 1 and Act 2 on separate discs, there are also instrumentalizations and vocalizations of the musical. And the bonus discs feature demos, sometimes sung by guests who just appeared to be visiting, for example, Damian Wilson. And did any of these accidental castings or early demos significantly changed the direction of final songs on the main album, and what was their impact on the album?
A lot of the vocalizations, they were just, you're pretty much right that people happen to be passing. And the first thing that happens is when I write the musical, as I say, I record all the vocals. So there it is, sitting with me singing to myself as King and replying as Jagman and singing and reacting as Eva, just my voice. So the first thing I do is, as and when I grab people, I just say, do you fancy singing this song just so I can have a different voice? Even though they're not necessarily going to be the person playing that role, just might be someone passing through. So Damien was here for a little while and I asked him to do some of the Tovenar parts, if I remember rightly. And Gemma comes and goes, so I was getting her to do some of the other female roles as well as her own. And yeah, I think I got Laura to do some other bits as well. And it was just that, really. It's a way of then you start to kind of hear the interaction of different voices and how that kind of works and my sort of final picture starts to take shape. So yeah, that's it really. And do they influence I don't think so. They take the journey in the way that I kind of want them to take it, really. So, but you know, maybe something comes out of that. Maybe some inflection or approach that Damien took made a difference to how Ryan ended up singing the part. Yeah, possibly.
Thank you. And I would like to ask you about the physical CD release of the album again, because the cover art and the entire visual layer of the album are very beautiful, atmospheric, minimalistic, and consistent with the previous parts of the alchemical musical, and the characteristic colors of the two earlier works are also preserved, that is black, red, and white. And the cover art depicts Professor King holding the titular mortal light, while the dark figure of Macaria looms ominously from behind. And beyond the literal representation of the characters, is there a deeper symbolism in this composition? For example, in the contrast between the small, fragile light in King's hand and the overwhelming darkness surrounding him? And could you tell me a bit more about the visual art style of the whole musical and the whole series?
Well, Mark Buckingham did the front of the box in that kind of graphic novel style. He did King's Ransom as well. We did something different for the first one because I hadn't at that stage met him. So yeah, I liked the flavor of this sort of black, red, and white thing, because I wanted the images on the front of the box sets to be very simple, a little bit like when, I don't know, when you see an advert for the Phantom of the Opera, you can identify it from just the mask, you know, or Wicked is probably just a green face or whatever, you know, witch's hat. I wanted something that was kind of defined the musical, but in a few strokes of a pen, as it were. And that's, of course, something Mark Buckingham was extremely good at. The artwork inside was developed by Ross, who, of course, plays one of the characters in the musical, and was, of course, the narrator in Song of the Wildlands as well. And he developed some pictures using kind of photographic elements of some of the people who were taking part and what have you. And then I developed some of those ideas a little bit further for the artwork inside the booklets. And of course, I presumably got a big pile of photographs in there as well. As far as the sort of message, I mean, the Mortal Light, I don't think that with what Mark Buckingham did on the front, I think he sums up the musical really well. You know, the Mortal Light, everyone is focusing on this amulet, this one little thing that somehow could be the sort of solving of the problem, and yet there, you know, and that, as you put it, sort of is the little thing, the fragile ornament, and yet the real problem is a much bigger thing, which is almost like people are almost unaware of. So there is that sort of message in the picture. I wouldn't go too much deeper than that, really. I think that sort of pretty much says what it needs to say. Then it's a question of discovering the actual story and understanding how that works.
And obviously, without any spoilers, what would you say the message of the whole album is?
Well, I think there's probably several messages in there, really. I mean, I think there's the theme of friendship, the theme of love, the good against evil. I'm not sure I'm trying to say anything overly deep beyond those kind of classic sort of elements. I've always enjoyed that sort of, well, for example, the adventure continues. For me, it's a flow from Alchemy to King's Ransom to the Mortal Light and beyond. It's, you know, you're just caught up in this sort of, hopefully, roller coaster of an adventure, and where it may or may not go. And as always, you know, unlike the modern attitude now in films and things, it's almost become de rigueur to kill off all the main characters and stuff like that. You know, that's never really interested me. I think if you have the characters you like, then you follow them through and you let them continue to have the adventure. Kill everyone else off by all means. But so you know, there's a sort of a safety is, that's not quite the right word, but I'll take it for now. A safety in the knowledge that you can follow these characters, and they may reach dangers and perils, and they, you know, but they're always there. suppose a little bit like the Star Trek series in a way, but you know, something like that. But I don't know beyond that. The message is just have fun with it.
And I would like to ask you a question about some pop culture references that I've noticed while listening to the album. I caught the reference to the movie Blade Runner and Roy Batty's famous monologue with the line "Tears lost in the rain" in Guardians Act 1. What's more, there is a track called Siege on this album, and Imaginarium Project also released an album titled Siege, both featuring Laura Piazai. And you, of course. And are these deliberate nods to connect your different musical worlds and make a link to a general pop culture, or are these just happy coincidences? And are there any other Easter eggs or tributes hidden in the musical that fans should be on the lookout for?
Well, the answer to that is yes. Most of the time I do make references, and I do it quite intentionally, and I do it because it entertains me. Tears in the Rain is a line I've absolutely loved ever since I heard it in the film. And obviously, I think you search through my lyrics, you're going to find it referred to in other songs as well. So that's always, it's just a great way of describing a particular thing. The Siege... The Siege was slightly more coincidental, in as much that I think I'd really, let me just think about this. Yes, Siege was written for the musical. It was written and there before we did the album, and then we landed on the name Siege for the album as well. But so I wasn't making the connection to Imaginarium because I'd already done it. I'd already written it. But there are a lot of references to films. I mean, I'll give you a couple of things to look out for. There's in the third Indiana Jones film where they're trying to take the cup out, and the knight has warned them not to cross the seal. You've seen the film, yeah? Yeah, okay. And the German lady has got the cup, and she's backing away. Come on, Indiana, we can take it with us. And then, of course, there's the complete chaos as the whole lot starts to collapse, and chasms in the floor open up. And she falls through one of these holes and drops the cup, and the cup's just out of reach. And she tries to reach for it, and Indiana Jones is hanging onto her hand, saying, let it go, and she falls. And he slips and falls into this chasm as well. And then he's caught by his dad, Sean Connery. And he's reaching, I can get, and the music's going all chaotically, and the sound effects and all the rest of it. And he's trying, I can get this, Dad, I can get this. And Sean Connery just says, Indiana. And that moment, suddenly everything becomes calm, where he uses his name, and everything becomes calm, and everything focuses right down to Sean Connery's voice about letting it go. And and it's incredible for me. I thought cinematically a very powerful moment. So in my own little tribute, I've done exactly the same thing. Not exactly the same thing, but I've done something like that. In the chaos that's ensuing near the end, and King is deciding that perhaps he should stay and set the explosives off, and Jagman's trying to persuade him not to. Jagman just says, Samuel. And then the music all closes down, and we get that wonderful 2-minute song from Jagman, which is, for me, was one of the highlights of the whole musical. It's just piano and voice, pretty much simple. And so that was a reference. And there's also a reference about another film I particularly love. It's called Without a Clue. And it's got Michael Caine, Ben Kingsley playing Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. But Sherlock Holmes is a complete buffoon who is, in fact, an actor hired by Watson to sort of portray a part. But Watson's the brains behind it all. And, of course, they don't get on. And there's a guarantee that, after they solve this one case, that Sherlock Holmes will step down and call it quits, and they, but they become friends during the story. And then at the end, Sherlock Holmes sort of says, well, that'll be my last case. And people say, what? No, surely not. And then basically Watson says, no, I mean, he's just joking, aren't you, what, Holmes? And Holmes says, right you are, Watson, and they carry on, and the adventure continues. So I've literally quoted that. Well, not quite, but right you are, I think you'll find is at the end. So there are lots of film references. I mean, that's two, but there are quite a few others, and there are also references to other things I've written. So yeah, but I'm not going to sit here and take you through it. That's down to the listener. They can be ignored. Equally happily, they can be ignored.
And I have one final question, ultimate question, because Samuel King seems to be in a constant state of a constant siege, because as soon as one adventure ends, another one begins, as you've just described. Also, in your booklet, you wrote about your own sieges, building a studio, moving houses, pandemics, and just like Professor King, you overcome these difficulties and achieve your intended goals. Therefore, the ultimate question is whether this is the final curtain for Samuel King, or did you leave that door slightly ajar for a potential fourth installment or a spin-off or in the future?
Well, I mean, you know, at the end of The Mortal Light, we have that moment I've just described from the film where, you know, he had promised Eva that this would be their last adventure, but Eva decides she doesn't want it to be either their last adventure. So he sort of says, okay, well, all right then. And at the very end of that story, of course, we hear that Queen Victoria has been kidnapped. Now, I don't necessarily, you know, like they're fighting vampires at the end of King's Ransom, but we don't end up fighting them in the beginning of The Mortal Light. You know, it's a message. I never said this would be a trilogy. And if I could live long enough, I would write 10 more of these because I enjoy them probably more than anybody else. So in my mind, this isn't the end of the adventure. Whether I write another one or not, it doesn't matter. But in my head, the walk into the sunset is that symbolic thing. Like again at the end, and that was another thing. Indiana Jones 3, as they literally ride off into the sunset. Same idea. I think the adventure continues.
And before we conclude, would you like to perhaps add anything more about the musical?
Well, I hope one day that we'll be able to put on a stage production of it, because I've always believed that the living, breathing show is more important even than the CD. That's a slightly different attitude towards bringing out these albums than I would do about bringing out an arena album or something. I'd love to think that we could perform it, perhaps even here at the Mead Hall. I've sort of entertaining that idea. The only thing that slows me down on that is the idea of having to learn all those lyrics for Professor King. But I do hope that we can perform it on stage. It would be nice. I now that we've got the three, Alchemy, King's Ransom, The Mortal Light, it would be nice. We performed the other two on stage more than once. So it would be nice to do that. And if we do, I really hope people out there perhaps will come and see it and keep this thing living, because I think a musical is a living and breathing thing that develops and is a kind of organic process, much more than the normal album, you know, and that is applied to each one. And of course, Alchemy perhaps being turned into a movie, could that lead to the other two becoming movies? That would be a lovely idea as well. So we shall see.
Clive, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this interview. It's been truly a pleasure to learn so much about the album, both in the narrative context as well as the technical mastery behind it. The Mortal Light by Clive Nolan is arriving on the 15th of February 2026. And every fan of epic and immersive music ought to experience this truly remarkable album and the crown jewel of the entire saga. Clive, once again, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for talking to me about it. And as always, great questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much.